No, I mean basically the estates were granted to a Sir Adam de Cothelstone, who came over with William the Conqueror, and as is often the case, those who came over with William the Conqueror were granted, lands and estates in recognition for what they'd done. And the Stoles, or at least the de Cothelstones as they then were granted Cothelstone. And about 150 years later, we think, around 150, 200 years later, they changed the name to Stole. And they then remained here from effectively 1066 through to about 1780, when the property was put on the market, and it was bought by the Esdale family, whose heirs and successors still own the estate. So it's actually only been in the hands of two families since 1066, which is pretty extraordinary. But we think but there's actually evidence of a much earlier occupation here. I mean, it's almost certainly been in continuous habitation since Saxon times, because there's a record of a King Cothelstone having been ensconced here with his wife in Saxon times. We're not quite sure whether the origins of Cothelstone are from Cothelwulf, the Saxon king, or whether they're from de Cothelstone. I think probably more likely from de Cothelstone. And certainly evidence supports the fact that there was a Saxon origins here, because there are Saxon and Norman origins in the church as well, in the rounded pillar. So it's an early settlement, and almost certainly in continuous habitation since Saxon times. The Cothelstone Stoles, I mean, their tenure was, well, it was 700 years thereabouts, which is pretty amazing. And I think they were able to stay here for so long because they pretty much kept their heads down. And if you kept your heads down in those times, you tended to keep it on, actually. If you stuck it above the head, above the parapet, you probably got it chopped off. So they were, I mean, you've been over the church, you've seen there are some pretty interesting tombs there, actually, some monuments to early Stoles. I mean, they were, I mean, this is not a grand stately home, this was actually originally a fortified manor house. And you can tell that from various things, not least of which is the height of the windows. I mean, you know, in here, particularly up there, particularly here, this is a very high window, this one here. And in the kitchen, you know, you can't see out the windows. So it would have been built as a fortified manor house. The gatehouse, which is, you know, listed grade 1 just out there, reinforces the whole thing. There was another gatehouse further up the drive, which was subsequently lost. They found, when they did the restoration in the 1860s, they found dungeons underneath the dining room. They found shackles and chains there. So very clearly, this was a fortified manor house. Stoles took part were fairly active in their own way. I mean, they took part in we think they went on the Crusades. We're not entirely sure of that, but there are indications on one of the tombs where the effigies are. There are some indications that they were Crusaders. They certainly raised an army at the time of the Spanish Armada to try and defend the country against the King of Spain. But they really came to fame in the Civil War, the English Civil War, when they did indeed stick their heads above the parapet, and I have to say nearly paid the price for that. They were very active. There was a very early skirmish in the Civil War, a little village called North Newton, which is quite close to here, where a large parliamentarian force coming out from Taunton was ambushed by a much smaller army led by Sir John Stole from here, and routed, and it was an early defeat for Cromwell. He's said to have been pretty hacked off about that, but it's probably not that which made him most hacked off. I think it was probably the fact that that Stole was active in other parts during the Civil War. I mean, they were staunch royalists throughout, And this was actually a very strongly parliamentarian area. All round here, Taunton and Somerset, much of the West Country was very parliamentarian. And it was some of the bigger families who were the royalists. Sir John was one of the leaders of the siege at Exeter, which was a very lengthy siege, and which ended in a royalist surrender rather than a defeat. Part of the terms of the surrender were that Sir John was given a free passage, as were all the leaders. Cromwell being Cromwell, he didn't keep to his word. Sir John was arrested, he was taken to London, and Cromwell ordered the house to be destroyed. And he'd had sworn earlier on in the Civil War that once it was over, no soul would ever live here again. And he ordered a chap called Admiral Blake, who was born and bred in Bridgewater, close by here, who is thought by many to be one of the founding figures of the modern Navy, to come out and destroy the house. And he placed his cannon on Cothelstone Hill, which is the big hill that you see as you come in down the drive. You look to your right, that's Cothelstone Hill. He bombarded the house. There are 2 cannonballs in the fireplace there, which were found at the time of the Restoration. And they were, I mean, they're heavy. I mean, they weigh 10 pounds and 20 pounds. That's a fair old weight. Those coming through the sky at the rate of knots would have indeed did do a great deal of damage. The house was brought down to ground floor level on that wing where the kitchen is. First floor height on this wing here. And we think probably not too badly affected on the far wing on that side. But the house was a ruin. I mean, it was destroyed. And what Blake and his cannon didn't do, the hordes from Taunton did. They poured out and they ransacked the whole place. So all the ceilings were lost, all the great fireplaces, the doors, everything was completely lost. And the house was left pretty much as a ruin. Sir John, meantime, was taken to London. He was invited to kneel at the bar of the House of Commons, which is the, I don't know if you know the structure of the House of Commons, but the opposite the Speaker's chair, there is a bar, effectively, behind where the clerks sit, and he was invited to kneel before the bar of the House of Commons and pledge an oath of allegiance to Cromwell and to Parliament. He refused to do so and was thrown into the Tower of London. He was never tried. We suspect that's because he was given this free passage at the end of the siege of Exeter. So even for Cromwell, it was too big an ask to have him tried and executed. So he spent the entire Civil War and the entire parliamentarian period languishing in the Tower of London, which can't have been a very pleasant experience. Amazingly, he survived, and he is actually recorded as one of the 100 Knights of the Shires who greeted Charles II on his entry into London on his restoration. So it must have been quite a moment for him, really, having seen Charles I executed, lost his estates, imprisoned, but then to survive all that. The estates were all restored to the Stowell family, but remember this was by now a ruined manor house. They never came back here to live. Sir John didn't last the year after his release from the Tower. His health had been destroyed by his incarceration, and he died on one of his other estates about 20 miles from here. He eventually came back here because he's buried in the church, and he was I don't know if you saw, actually, there's an amazing description of the funeral of Sir John Stowell that took place in 1661 or 2, I think it was. I mean, it obviously was a remarkable occasion. His body was brought from the estates at Ham, where the Stowells also lived, and in fact where there are quite a lot of tombs and graves of Stowell family, just like there are in our church here. And it's about 20 miles from here. It took 2 days for the funeral procession to come from Ham. He was borne on a carriage pulled by 6 black-plumed horses with 120 mounted followers, riders, and he laid up overnight in Bishop's Lydian Church, and then brought here the next day for the funeral and the burial. We have a record of all of this, and we have a record of some of those who attended, and all the, we have various heralds. I don't know if you Garter King of Arms, Lion King of Arms. They all came down here in 1660, whatever it is, or something, for Sir John's funeral. Yeah, that must have been a hell of a thing. I mean, that's that would have been a long journey, several weeks. Yeah. They were here in their heralds' medieval uniforms and everything. So he was clearly quite a distinguished figure. But his death really ended the connection, the Stoles of this house. I mean, they never came and lived here again. House was restored in a sort of, in a semi-ruined state as a farmhouse. I don't know if you've seen one of the books in there. There are illustrations of the house at various different stages. Originally 3 stories high, yes, with a balustrade round the top.
Yeah, we've seen that.
Yeah, and then 2 stories high when they restored it. But at the time of Sir John's release, it was a ruin, effectively. Just existed as a farmhouse. Sir John, there's not much record of the Stoles after his death. There was a Lord Stole, so clearly at some stage they were ennobled. His only claim to fame seems to be that he took an absolute dislike to Judge Jeffreys, with the bloody assizes which were held in Taunton. Probably not an entirely sensible thing to do, given his reputation for dispensing summary justice. There are various descriptions of what he called Judge Jeffreys. I mean, the one I like most of all is he described him as a bloody vagabond and a ruffian. I think that's probably not an entirely sensible thing to have done. And indeed, Judge Jeffreys took great exception to that, and he did indeed dispense his summary justice. What I don't understand, and what nobody really knows, is it wasn't Lord Stole who was on the receiving end of this. Either he was too important or too far away. What actually happened was that 3 poor unfortunate individuals, whose names we actually have, were brought out here and they were hanged from the gatehouse at the end from the archway at the end of the drive. So you spoke out against Judge Jeffreys, if not at your peril, at somebody else's anyway. And then there is a son. Lord Stole had a son, but he died at age 17 of smallpox or chickenpox while he was at Westminster College, and that really ended the connection the Stole family had here. The estates were put on the market quite a bit later. I mean, they retained them until about 1780, something like that. And they were then put on the market, and they were quite big. There were 56 houses and farmhouses at the time that the whole estate was put up for sale. And it was then bought by the Esdale family. Esdales were bankers. Times don't change. Bankers had a lot of money, and they bought the estate. And actually, what is quite interesting, I mean, I think the history of the English country house is quite interesting, because it's a history of change. It's very much a history of birth, destruction, death often, reconstruction. And actually what you have here on this estate and in this house is very much that history of what happens to the English country house. I mean, you've got this house first built here in the early 1500s. There was almost certainly an earlier manor house. Actually, where the cottages are, you would have walked past them to go to the church. There was almost certainly an earlier manor house there. A house built in the 1500s, destroyed in the mid-1600s, and left pretty much as a ruin. The Esdales, when they bought the estate, clearly wanted to make their mark, so they built a brand new house, big classical mansion over the other side of the park. Big Georgian mansion, very big. The drive that leads to it took one man to sweep one way 1 week and another week to sweep it back the other way.
Is it still in existence?
No. Well, they built the house. They put in a park. They put in a 7.5 acre lake. They built a huge coach house behind it and another walled garden. But it had a very short life. I mean, it was built in 1830 and it was pulled down in 1958.
Oh.
Because at that time, tax rates in this country were very high. You were talking about income tax at around 98% on high earning income, huge death duties and capital duties. And trustees didn't think, that sort of house was going to be lived in. The last Squire Esdale died without children, left the property to a niece who was married to a colonial policeman living and working in Kenya. So the trustees ordered the place to be pulled down. I mean, the extraordinary thing is that there is now another house there, because the coach house that was behind that mansion was never pulled down. And the owners of the estate converted that about 12 years ago, and they now live there, and that's actually bigger than this. And then in the late 1850s, early 1860s, the Esdales, who by now had got their own house, decided to restore this to it, pretty much to its original footprint. So the house was restored very much to the same footprint. We believe there was a wing out the back, which was not restored. This hall was narrowed by 7 feet in order to make the span of beams easier.
Oh, I see.
It was restored actually as the main tenant farmer's house on the estate. Quite grand, you might think, for the main tenant farm. But it's quite interesting. There are journals done at the time of the restoration in the 1850s, 1860s, the Esdale journals, which are now in the county archives in the museum in Taunton. And they record what happened here. They record finding the dungeons underneath the dining room. They record finding the shackles and chains. They record also that he comments, and we're talking about 1858, 1860 here. And there clearly was a stone spiral staircase in the corner here. And he comments in these journals, just remove the stone spiral staircase. Not entirely sure we should have done so. And we're talking now about 1860, but hardly suitable for modern day living. So even then they were thinking about how you live in a house today, because it was no longer a fortified manor house, it was now a house, a country house. And they also raised that part of the house there, you can see some steps going up into that wing. They raised the floors so that you could look out of the windows, because obviously if we're not fortified anymore. We don't need to be fortified. We actually want to enjoy the view. So the floors are raised, and you have a completely different aspect from the drawing room than you have from here and the kitchen. So this evolution that takes place is extraordinary, really, and I find it fascinating that here we are now, sitting in a house that was first built here in the early 1500s, was destroyed pretty much in the mid 1600s. Was restored again in the 1850s, 1860s, and is now lived in as a family home. So this is very much, this is the history of the English country house. This is what happened to these houses. They changed and adapted. They have to change. They have to adapt in order to survive. I mean, I'm passionate about the English country house. It's a remarkable institution, and unless they adapt and change, they won't and don't and can't survive. So it is a history of change. I mean, if you look at an estate like this, 50, 60 years ago, this manor was, and the Cothelstone house over there, because it was still just about being lived in then, only just, would have been the centre of this whole hamlet. I mean, there are about 120 people who live in this hamlet. This house would have provided the employment they employed about 45 people full time on this estate. Nothing has changed in the last 60 years in terms of the size of the estate. It's still about 1,800 acres. The number of houses in the hamlet are still the same. The number of people living in this hamlet of Cothelstone are about 120. But other changes have happened. We used to have a school here, that's gone. We used to have a village hall here, that's gone. The church would have been absolutely full when this was the centre of the estate. Because if you lived on the estate, if you worked on the estate, you jolly well went to church on the estate. Now, the one big thing that has changed is that in 50 years, despite the fact that the property is all the same, the number of hamlets are here, but instead of there being 40 to 50 full-time people working on the estate and their families, who would have all been part of this estate, that 40 or 50 people is now just one person working full-time on the estate. Nothing unusual in that across the country. I mean, that is the change that has taken place. I mean, agriculture has completely changed.
Right.
The need for people to work on the land has gone. So these houses have had to change their purpose, if you like, because they're no longer the centre of a working, thriving community. I mean, all the food would have come off the estate, all the wages would have come off it, all the education, they would have been educated on the estate. They went to church in the estate, so the whole thing was a little community, a self-supporting community, if you like, that existed. That's all gone because of the nature of farming and what is happening in the countryside. So these houses have gone through vast change, right from early days, the early 1500s, right up to now, and they'll go on changing because that's the only way they will survive. And what you see now is the house that was effectively built on this site in the early 1500s, but restored in the 1850s, 1860s. I mean, the interesting thing is that there are some features that are absolutely original, and that's one of them, these incredible mullioned, rounded mullions between the paned glass. They are incredibly unusual. Most houses of this period have either square or rectangular mullions. The great English architectural historian of the early 1900s, a chap called Pevsner, who wrote masses about English country houses, records this house as being, these windows as being most unusual. They actually are extremely unusual. There is only one other house in England that has these rounded mullions, and that's a house called Sydenham House, just outside Launceston in Devon. So clearly, whoever lived here and whoever lived at Sydenham, obviously one copied the other, we don't know which. But they are almost unique. I mean, there's one other house that has them. So, and this is a quirk of English country houses. You get this, you get these extraordinary rarities in that sense. So it is an interesting house. It's got an interesting history. I mean, you saw you've been up the Wall Garden, haven't you?
Yeah.
Well, the gazebo that was that you saw there, that building with the arches, that was built for the wedding of Sir John Stowell in 1619. And it still survived, It's extraordinary. The gatehouse, now that was untouched by the damage done to the Civil War, to the house in the Civil War. I mean, we have a series of listings, gradings, I don't know if you know our historic houses, grade 1, grade 2 star and grade 2. And everything here, except the church and the gatehouse, is grade 2 star. Church and the gatehouse are grade 1. And grade 1 is actually quite a rare listing. I mean, you have to be a very important building to be a grade 1 listed building, and that gatehouse is a very rare survival of its type. And actually, that was never damaged at the time of the Civil War. If you look at the windows there, you'll see them. I mean, they're very similar to these, but they are actually amazing. Although the floors have fallen in because it was last lived in 1910. The fireplaces, the original fireplaces, are still in the upstairs walls. So it is, it's and that was also built in the early 1500s. So it's an unusual and interesting house.